Okay, so we're just going to finish up with schizophrenia, talking about the possible causes of it. Before we do that, they've classified now two different types of schizophrenia, depending on when symptoms come on, how serious the symptoms are, what type of symptoms you have, etc. Chronic schizophrenia, chronic meaning lifetime, is type of schizophrenia that, as we said, usually appears late teens, early 20s. In men, it tends to be more severe. Men have this one more often. The thing with this type of schizophrenia, even though schizophrenia for a lot of people is a rapid decline, and a lot of schizophrenic patients don't show symptoms until they start having symptoms. This one is usually a little bit slower developing, and they tend to show more of the negative symptoms, meaning the lack of motor movement, strange motor movement, that sort of stuff. These ones also tend to be more socially isolated, and they oftentimes show those, especially social isolation symptoms, earlier than the actual onset of schizophrenia. So these might be people who develop it late teens or early 20s, but they've shown sort of social withdrawal and whatnot for the majority of their life. Because this one is chronic, recovery, and it's mostly the negative symptoms, which they don't necessarily know how to treat as well. Recovery from this one is unlikely, even though it tends to get better as they get older. These are going to be mostly the patients that don't recover from it and they suffer for their entire life because this type does not respond as well to drugs. This one has more of a genetic component to it. We look at, these are the brains of two identical twins, one of which is schizophrenic, one is not. You can see these brain abnormalities in the schizophrenic patient, the enlarged ventricle, showing more of the biological irreversible cause there. The other type of schizophrenia that can appear a lot faster, can appear in people that are perfectly well adjusted and usually in response to some sort of trauma, is what is called acute schizophrenia. When something is acute, it means it kind of just comes on really quickly. This type of schizophrenia can appear at any time, and this is where we see what is rare but can happen, which is childhood schizophrenia, where they may suffer as a child, but as they get closer to late teens, early 20s, it might actually get better. This type of schizophrenia tends to show more of the positive symptoms, the hallucinations and the delusions and the disorganized thinking. Because of this, recovery is more likely. This is more of maybe environmental factors triggering genes. And this type of schizophrenia tends to respond to drugs more. The drugs that are used to treat psychotic disorders, called antipsychotics, generally look to treat those positive symptoms. So this type actually responds to drugs better. So, possible causes of schizophrenia. One of which that they know is dopamine overactivity, particularly we just looked at the picture of those enlarged ventricles. The enlarging of the ventricles leads to more surface area for actually more of what are called D4 receptors, dopamine 4 receptors. They tend to, they see in some schizophrenic patients as many as 6 times more of these D4 receptors. Again, the dopamine is usually associated with more of the positive symptoms. The way that they know this is because drugs that block dopamine receptors, which are known as antagonistic drugs, because they block the production of a neurotransmitter, have been found to lessen these symptoms. Again, these are drugs that are called antipsychotics. The other evidence that they have of this is drugs that stimulate dopamine receptors, what are called dopaminergic or dopamine agonists, such as illegal drugs like cocaine, speed. A legal version of that is Adderall. Um, along with that, drugs that help with the symptoms of Parkinson's disease have been known to intensify symptoms of schizophrenia. And with Parkinson's disease, there is a side effect of those drugs where patients can sometimes start showing signs of schizophrenia, particularly the positive symptoms. This side effect is called tardive dyskinesia. They've also seen people display symptoms like psychotic behavior after doing a lot of drugs like cocaine or speed. This is what is called cocaine psychosis. So they found with those drugs that the drugs that affect dopamine have differing effects on level of psychosis. They have found different evidence of different brain activity, different abnormal brain activity. Um, they have seen in the frontal cortex, they see up here, they sometimes see a thinning of the frontal cortex. Okay. And also these red areas show more tissue loss. Okay. This would correlate with auditory hallucinations, all right, because there's the temporal lobe where those auditory hallucinations would originate from. They also have found shrinkage of the thalamus in schizophrenic patients, showing that the lack of ability to handle sensory information, and also abnormal activity in the amygdala, the area of the brain that deals with emotion, emotional regulation, and again, other biological brain-related possible causes. There's the thinning of the cortex, right, in the frontal lobe and in the top of the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Going back to this slide here, here's parietal lobe deals with then the somatosensory cortex that deals with sensations. Here's the motor cortex here that deals with motor movement. Both of these would correlate with sensation without perception or perception without sensation, hallucinations, even if it's tactile, meaning touch, and then the strange motor movements associated with it, such as catatonia and waxy flexibility. These enlarged ventricles. The ventricles, we have 4 of these in our brain. They hold cerebrospinal fluid, which our brain uses for nutrients. They've found that, again, these are identical twins right here. This twin has schizophrenia. This one does not. Their ventricles are significantly larger. And going back, this is where they see the higher level of the D4 receptor. There are also environmental factors. It's not just biological, as we know. Prenatal factors. They have found that in the northern hemisphere, that kids that are born in the winter, kids that are born in the winter and therefore spend more time in the womb during flu season, during the critical periods of development, their risk of schizophrenia goes up compared to those who are born later in the summer and therefore would be in the womb at a less critical period during flu season. And it's correlate with contracting a viral infection during pregnancy. So the prenatal environment plays a role, even with this is where we would get the differences in identical twins because they share they share the same genes, but their prenatal environment could be slightly different. There is a strong genetic component to it. Okay, if one identical twin is diagnosed with schizophrenia, the other twin has about a 50% chance of also being diagnosed with schizophrenia. So, and that is far above the regular heritability of schizophrenia in a regular population. I'm not sure what it is off the top of my head, but the heritability, the difference between individuals um, attributed genes is lower with non-genetically related individuals. And you can even see the difference here between identical twins and fraternal twins. Again, here's another one, okay? Almost a 50% chance of an identical twin, two children of two schizophrenic patients, the risk is extremely high as well. And then also going back to the diathesis stress model, okay? If you are biologically predisposed to schizophrenia, we're going back to biopsychosocial diathesis stress. If you're biologically predisposed to schizophrenia, it doesn't necessarily mean you are going to suffer from it. The diathesis stress model would say, let me make sure I don't say like genes plus environmental stressors can make it more likely to suffer from it. And then also we have these four genetically identical Janine sisters. They all suffer from schizophrenia. However, two of them have it worse than the other two. So that would again point to an environmental factor as well. Okay, so those, I believe that's the last slide. There are the possible causes of schizophrenia that you need to know. One thing that I think I forgot to say in a couple classes, one of the other, as we said, it exists in about 1% of the population. However, not all populations are affected equally. African American populations are actually affected at a higher rate, and as are low income populations. This could point again to that stress factor. Stress of low income and being genetically predisposed could trigger it. Along with that, low income communities are going to have less access to good health care, which can then exacerbate the symptoms. If not treated, it will get worse. Okay, all right, so there you go, causes of schizophrenia.